We used to say the left hand doesn't know what the right hand's doing. We don't have to say that anymore because left and right are hand in hand. Whatever I say next about the left or the right, what I really mean is the old guard, the uniparty, the establishment. What I've been watching this week is the further collapse of what still calls itself the left into deluded anti-human madness. Truly a wonder to behold. Here in the UK, there's a newly minted government calling itself Labour. Many of us remember when the Labour Party of the United Kingdom stood for the rights of working people, or at least it said it did. We could debate how sincere and authentic was that stance and that claim, but at least there was a time when representatives of the Labour Party, many of whom came from working backgrounds, coal miners, steel workers and the like, at least appeared to challenge those demonstrably intent on taking advantage of working people or on treating working people with out-and-out contempt. That British Labour Party was also patriotic, proud of the heritage and history of people descended from ancestors who'd built Britain, often with their bare hands, people who'd fought and often died for Britain. There was a strong anti-war element too, driven by those who understood that war is just another way to get rid of inconvenient people while making billions at the same time. I could go on, but my point is that the Labour Party in this country, indeed the so-called left in this country, used to at least pose, and quite convincingly, to be fair, as a bulwark between the people and the autocrats and authoritarians who wanted only to milk the people for whatever could be had from them. By now, however, the Labour Party, whatever it once was, whatever its founder Keir Hardie had in mind in the beginning, is now a flayed skin, flayed from the backs of the workers and worn as a cynical disguise, so that the Labour Party is no more and no less than sheep's clothing worn by the wolf itself. Anything authentic and heartfelt by that Labour Party by what the Labour Party once represented is utterly gone, never to return, for good or ill. It's interesting always to remember that the original logo of the Fabian Society, founded in 1884 and dedicated to achieving socialism not by revolution but by stealth, was that self-same wolf in sheep's clothing. The Fabians, still alive and sneaking, are named after a Roman general, Fabius, remembered for his tactic of patiently wearing down his enemies over time. Now the empty, heartless marionette that is Labour has cast aside the wants of workers. Safe borders, stable communities, energy that's affordable and reliable, employment based on merit and not to meet inclusivity and diversity targets. Labour now, just like the Conservatives before, and as I said at the top, the other side of the uniparty coin is every bit as empty, disingenuous, existing only to serve the needs of the globalist agenda, its representatives being no more than factotums, puppeticians moved by strings pulled from above. The party that once claimed to stand for workers, in my view, stands now for smothering arable land beneath solar panels, chasing farmers out of the food business in a time of worldwide food uncertainty, for impoverishing what remains of the middle class, for committing billions as yet unearned by the taxpayers who'll foot the bill to 100 years of war in Ukraine, a war not for democracy, but only to secure the return on investments made by transnational corporations like BlackRock, to secure access to Ukrainian oil for the enrichment of the same corporate entities that profit still from the Iraqi oil made available by the illegal Iraq war, the war that killed 1 million civilians. The usual suspects like ExxonMobil, Chevron and Halliburton. Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky was the guest of the Labour cabinet this week, colours firmly nailed to the mast there. Today's UK Labour government, as far as a reasonable person might conclude, might as well be in the business of financing the spilling of torrents of blood in pursuit of pumping oil, not here at home for domestic profit, but thousands of miles away for foreign corporations, knowingly standing by while innocent people of a land far away are slaughtered so that the rich of other foreign countries grow richer still. In my view, the Labour Party of this country is an abject and shameful travesty of anything the word left ever meant. Ironically, left now means only what it always meant, even to people with no interest in politics, which is to say, left is the opposite of everything that's right, right with a small r, right as in true. Nowadays, that which calls itself the left has descended into a decadent, spectacular self-destruct mode, not just here, but all over the world. It's likely that the self-destruction is deliberate, since politics are no longer required in a uniparty, in a one-world government world in which right and left are meaningless anachronisms. Every day, the left, that other side of the uniparty coin, is more exposed as only the manifestation of greed, envy, and hate. Across the pond, in the USA, the madness of the left seems to be at fever pitch as well, frothing at the mouth, bug-eyed bonkers, in fact. I keep thinking things can get no crazier there in the home of the brave, but over and over I find I must only wait a bit for things to get crazier yet, so we'll see. The left in American politics manifests in the main as the Democratic Party, of course. That's what we're invited to believe, at least, since left is as meaningless there as here. It's hard to see those so-called Democrats, once the party of Jack and Bobby Kennedy, as anything but irrelevant now, rendered that way by their having given in, it would appear, to undisguised, full-blown hatred of anyone and everyone that stands in opposition to the naked application of power. In my opinion, the Democrats are now the monsters their predecessors once claimed to exist to fight. A notion like a person's character being more important than their skin colour is just one of many platitudes cast aside as yet more flayed skins, empty and dead as the sheep's skin cloaking the reality of UK Labour. All this inversion of what had gone before, of the turning inside out and upside down of morality, of sanity itself, surely reached some kind of peak in the immediate aftermath of the bloodying of Donald Trump at the rally in Pennsylvania. So filled with seething hatred are the Democrats and the craven, paid-for mainstream media that dances to their hellish tune, hatred not just of Donald Trump, but of any fellow citizen that prefers him to the human wreck that is President Joe Biden. So surrendered to hatred are those posing as Democrats and their ilk. Their instinctive responses to the blood and bullets were either to pretend nothing much had happened or to say President Trump had brought it all upon himself. I was especially struck by the reflexive tendency towards making light of the firing of live rounds when a man, a husband and father, was killed in the same moment as the winging of Trump by a bullet to the brain. That tragedy for a family, but also, given the circumstances, for any nation claiming to be civilised, or at least claiming to value the well-being of its people, appeared not to matter. What mattered was to dismiss the apparent attempt on the life of the former president, who, in the end, seemed to be saved not by any action by what we're invited to believe is the best equipped, best financed Secret Service on the planet, but rather moving his head at the last moment, and then his having had the presence of mind to drop behind the armoured cladding on the front of the stage. Whatever happened that day, whoever is behind it and why, an innocent man is dead. Other innocents are injured. I say again, the left has lost it. The left has dropped the mask, thrown it away entirely. The left has given in to the base nature of the worst of people, given in to hatred. I watched the developing story of the shooting, how the politicians and the legacy media took a breath, saw the writing on the wall and started rolling out the rhetoric about America being no place for violence of any kind. In ways I can't fathom myself, the American left seemed to run out of words, so that some of their morning mainstream media shows, Morning Joe on MSNBC, for example, decided not to comment, opting only for rolling news. It seems to me that when they no longer felt self-righteous and safe doing the only thing they'd been doing, which is loudly hating Trump and finding forms of words that previously had sought to make him a target of one sort or another, they were left with nothing to say, no policies, no point. When hating Trump was off the table, even for them, they had nothing at all. A person might think that if the Democrats really believe Trump is like Hitler or Stalin, as they've been howling for months, calling him a fascist and a would-be dictator, if that comparison to dictators of the past came from somewhere authentic, something honestly heartfelt, they would truly want rid of him once and for all. But when whatever happened, happened, when Donald Trump dropped on that stage and then appeared blood-stained and defiant moments later, the so-called left had nothing but hollow calls for unity and an end to hateful rhetoric, when hateful rhetoric has been their only stock in trade. When push came to shove, even their hatred was hollow, as it turned out, empty. In the end, exposed to the bright light of day, the American left aren't even convincing baddies. All of it makes a person, a thinking person, wonder just what on earth we're being invited to watch now. There's an emptiness about all of it. Beneath the bellowing voices, the theatrically bared teeth, reality is hard to find. Sincerity seems absent. All of it has an unmistakable end of empire feel about it as well. And the scramble, or perhaps the coordinated effort, a last desperate effort to distract us from the fakery of it all, behind the stages, the podiums, the looming shadow, is global war. Last week, George Robertson, exhumed from the graveyard of the House of Lords, was sounding off in his role as leader of the UK Strategic Defence Review. Robertson is now warning everyone who'll listen that we, as in the West, we must get militarily serious about what he describes as the serious threat posed by China and others in the East. He is only echoing Admiral Bauer, NATO's senior military officer, who's been telling NATO allies of the need to prepare what he called a whole-of-society approach to war. To me, that sounds a lot like working towards conscription. Bauer has talked of the need for more bodies, which seems like an unfortunate choice of words in the context of the meat grinder in Ukraine that has minced countless thousands of bodies and counting. Here's the thing. I talked about the apparent madness of the so-called left, a madness little different, if at all, from the madness of the so-called right. What worries me is that it's not madness, nothing out of control, nothing as it seems. What worries me most of all is that behind all the fireworks is nothing more than the cold-blooded determination to keep the rich rich and the powerful powerful. They want only to keep the money and power, and to achieve that, they would march our children to war. If that day comes, I know who I'll be going to war with. I'm joined today by broadcaster and lawyer and friend, Andrew Eborn. Hello, Andrew. How are you?
I'm very well, Neil, and it's nice to connect you over so many miles with this terrible disaster that we've had with this IT meltdown. Does warn you about dependency on technology, doesn't it?
It does. I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, what a few days, a week or so it's been. You know, with the shooting of Trump. You know, with the recent advent of a new government in 10 Downing Street in London. You know, with the trouble unfolding in Leeds on Friday, you know, and then this whatever it was, this technological falling over. If it wasn't a heat wave coming, it would feel in every sense that things are hotting up.
Oh, no, absolutely. But again, it sort of highlights that point when you get broadcasters and airlines and banking systems all collapsing. And it wasn't even as a result of third-party action, from what we can understand. It was an update which was supposed to be basically go seamlessly. It didn't go seamlessly, and the whole thing grinds to a halt. Whilst I'm an advocate of technologies, you know, I speak around the world as a futurist, encouraging people to embrace technology. I'd always make sure that there's a plan B, because if you're heavily reliant on it and the thing collapses, then we're basically left adrift.
And when it comes to we've got to contemplate what happened to President Trump. What did you make? I know it's impossible to be clear about exactly what happened and the rest of it, but what did you make of the immediate aftermath? You know, the way in which the various media fell over themselves in all manner of ways of reporting what had happened.
Yeah, there was all the backtracking. You're right. The words that people have been using, which is basically encouraging violence, if you like. And Biden himself was sort of turned around and say when he meant let's have him in the crossfire, he didn't mean that at all. He meant you've got to focus on Trump. So they're all backpedaling on that sort of stuff. CNN have been much more gentle, apparently, on Trump's family when they're interviewing them and so on and so forth. But there are so many questions about that particular incident. I mean, if the security service, some of the best in the world, weren't able to spot somebody who's just 100 yards or so away from the main stage, it's extraordinary. I also saw a number of the witnesses there talking about how they spotted this particular person with his sniper and so on and so forth, and they alerted various people, but it wasn't until later that they did anything about it. So there are many, many questions to be answered, not least about how that particular person got onto the roof just 100 yards away from the president or the past president.
What was your reaction to the way in which the Labour government hit the street running towards its various targets?
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, they're only a couple of weeks into it, as we say, and we had the King's speech where they outlined all of these plans, some of which were a surprise, some weren't properly mentioned, like AI and so on and so forth, and voting for under 16. Everybody expected that to happen. It wasn't in the speech. Time will tell. They promised a timeline of 100 days, for example, with this new employment bill, and obviously it's not 100 days from when it might be enacted, because it has to go through the process. But there's all sorts of changes there, and mega rights, if you like, for employees now, and giving them rights from the very first day when they start, the end of 0-hour contracts, and all of those sort of things. And it's got to, basically, the devil will be in the detail, but it is early days yet. Let's see what happens. But I predict that people will be disappointed, because politics follows that pattern, doesn't it? We have a sort of stage where everybody is so desperate that they want to have something new, and that was the whole Labour campaign, was about change. And I suspect that a lot of people will be very disappointed that change may not be as quick as people predict. But also, if you look at the voter turnout, actually the biggest winner in the election was apathy. It had the lowest turnout for a long time, below 60%. Labour, whilst they got a large percentage of that, basically the votes were fragmented to a lot of these new parties. So Reform, for example, got 14% of the vote, but only 5 seats, whereas the Liberal Democrats got 12%, less than Reform's total vote, and they ended up with 72. So people thinking about a democratic system are going to be a bit frustrated and disappointed, I think, and I think that's going to pan out over the next few weeks.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, we're upon the first break already. Since as you probably spotted, I'm broadcasting from home on account of the technological problems that we're talking about. So I'm severely tempted to go and make myself a cup of tea in the break. But afterwards, we'll be discussing the first report published by the United Kingdom COVID-19 inquiry, which has been investigating how well we were prepared for the outbreak of a pandemic. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Our first topic tonight is the first report released by the COVID inquiry, which has been, well, extremely critical of the plans which were in place to deal with a potential pandemic outbreak. The report stated that flaws in the preparations meant the pandemic caused more deaths and economic damage than were necessary, and that the UK government and devolved nations failed their citizens. First Minister John Swinney said the Scottish Government would consider in great detail the findings and learn lessons from them. I believe Scotland is better prepared for any future scenario, but we must be constantly learning the lessons, he said. The First Minister added, I believe Scotland is better prepared for any future scenario, but we must be constantly learning the lessons of the experience we had during our pandemic preparedness to see if it's as effective as it can be to deal with any threat that's faced by the public. I'm joined now to discuss all of this by Bella Hastie, co-author of The Accountability Deficit and director of Us for Them. Good evening, Bella.
Hi, Neil.
Thanks for joining us in these slightly unusual circumstances. You've heard me talk about this subject ad nauseum in various contexts. Is this a whitewash? Is this an attempt just to absolve the key players of any real responsibility?
I think it's slightly more complex than that. And it's hard to necessarily tell us whether it's a whitewash or not yet, because it is only the first report of probably 9 or 10 more. And it may well end up being that way. It's been very clearly put forward in the media that the story is that people died due to government incompetence and they prepared for the wrong pandemic. When you look at the detail of Baroness Hallett's work, there are lots of things that you and I could have said early on. We could have said that actually it's an incredibly complex process that the UK had, and it focused on committees rather than outcomes, and there was no transparency or ownership. We would have said that it did appear to lack any flexibility. And more importantly, it didn't actually look at what they had proposed in the past and that what they proposed on the basis of the original pandemic. So there's some really important information in there, which says basically they decided that they had the wrong pandemic and therefore they were just making it up on the hoof and they were working it through. And this meant that they didn't look at any of the interconnected risks or the balance of harms or any of the knock-ons. And this is something that people like us have been saying for the last 4 years. And we were saying it at the time, weren't we? That they weren't looking at the balance of harms. They weren't looking at any of the implications. And it's reassuring that Baroness Hallett has actually said that. However, this document doesn't point fingers at individuals per se. It points fingers at the system. There'll be more, I think, individuals within the next modules as we go through.
Do you get the sense? I'll be frank. I get the sense that what's being set up here is a situation in which, if and when something similar happens again, is launched upon us again, that they will feel justified. They will feel justified in the same people taking control without ever having had to pause to take account of the damage that was done the last time.
I think that's a huge worry. I think that's a huge worry, Neil. I think there are some elements within the module report which actually could give us a little bit of hope, but you could also interpret it in another way. So, for example, Baroness Hallett talks about how legal coercion was not a policy, but she doesn't necessarily make it clear that it shouldn't be a policy and shouldn't be something that had been looked at, nor at any point have they appeared to look at the laws that they chose to lock us down. That may come in module 2, but in the hearings, no one asked about it. The other really big thing is that she talks and says lockdown was something that no one had ever considered before. Therefore, there was no plan and no one understood the impact. And lockdown should only be used as a last resort. You could interpret that as a positive, that she's at least assuming that lockdown is a last resort, or you could take it as, well, they're preparing for us for the fact that lockdown is an option. We just have to understand the impact and understand why that happens. It's hard to tell at the moment.
Andrew Eborn, what's your reaction? Admittedly, this is the first of what are expected to be several statements coming out, but what do you make of the tenor of what we've had so far?
Well, the language is incredibly strong, isn't it?
Sorry, Bella. I was just meaning that for
we're traveling. It might be a bit over. Yeah, too many Andrews, but it's a slightly different one. I know it's the joy of working remotely. The language, I think, is very interesting, isn't it? Because it's very strong. She talks about serious errors of state and fatal strategic flaws. And I always say history repeats itself because we don't learn the lessons from history. And in the report, they talk about actually they were ill prepared, and what they did was wrong. They basically were doing it as though it might be a flu epidemic or something along those sort of basis. But it is the first report. And what I find shocking, actually, is that we've just had the election and not once did COVID come up in the questions on either part, any of the parties, as to how they behaved and the responses that they did. There will be many more questions which still have to be answered. And I think things about the inoculations and so on and so forth, that's going to be coming further down the line. So serious questions to be answered. But so far, the report is fairly condemning.
Bella, it was shocking to me, really, that Sir Ian Vallance, Chief Scientific Officer during the so-called pandemic, has now been made Minister of Science or similar by the incoming Labour government, which, if that isn't rubbing people's noses in the intention to carry on much as though nothing had happened, could they have done anything more to annoy the wounded public?
I totally agree with you, and I think this is one of the problems with these kind of sliding door, rotating windows that we have of people moving through the scientific world and moving from pharmaceutical to government to NHS and all the way through. And we don't actually have any way of linking this through. One thing that Baroness Hallett does talk about is a lack of transparency through this, and I think we'd all agree on that. And she actually talks about the fact that there was a lack of parliamentary scrutiny, which throughout the pandemic. We'd absolutely agree on that. And when we were looking at the accountability deficit, one of the things that really stood out to us was when we looked at the care home mandates, which was a shocking thing that happened in 18 months in to the pandemic. But at that point, there was not even an impact assessment. So legally, you couldn't pass that law without an impact assessment. This was raised by the House of Lords on a number of occasions, and it was raised by parliamentarians who actually described themselves as feeling like they were living in the Scream, and yet it was still bulldozed through.
Coming up, we'll be debating whether the UK should be adopting much stronger measures in order to try and achieve net zero, whatever that means, or whether it is a futile enterprise. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show, hosted at least in part from my house. A government watchdog, the Committee on Climate Change, says the new Labour administration needs to hugely increase the generation of renewable energy if the UK is not to breach the Paris Agreement. The previous government has committed to a reduction of 68% in annual carbon emissions by 2030 compared with 1990 levels. Is such a target remotely achievable, and is it even desirable for us to take measures which could potentially have a negative economic impact? I'm joined now by Greg Gormley from Scoot Eco, which offers carbon footprint solutions for businesses. Hello, Greg, are you there?
Hello, I am indeed. How are you?
I'm fine. Greg, I don't know how aware you've been of the stance that I've taken on all of this over the months and years, but if not, I am of the opinion that the climate crisis, so-called, is a scam. And right. Therefore, even before we get to debating the pros and cons of the efforts to get to net zero, persuade me if you can that any of this is any more than maximising profit for the usual suspects.
Right. Well, certainly, you have the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change. It's basically the top 195 scientists from around the globe. And with their sixth assessment, they have established and said that human beings are warming up the planet. And that is the main premise from where climate change starts. Now, there is the argument about speed. There's the debate about the naysayers saying, it's going to happen in the next decade. It's not going to happen in hundreds of years. But ultimately, the bottom line crux is human beings are warming up the planet. And that is the starting point where I'd go from.
You accept that? Would you say that is no longer a matter for debate?
I would say it's no matter for debate anymore, because you can look over the past 25, 50 years and you can actually see the temperatures going up on an increased basis. And I know there's lots of debate about the Earth has been different temperatures over the years, but the reality is human beings weren't on the planet when woolly mammoths were there, etc. So we have to be careful about what we're doing with the planet. And if you look at what we're doing today, just in terms of A, how we live, B, how we have everything pre-packed and just have everything so ready for us, that we are actually causing this damage to the planet that is actually doing this warming up.
A friend of mine, Nick Hudson, has what he calls a heuristic, really, that he calls Hudson's razor. And he says that when anything is described as a global crisis, And when it's insisted that there are only top-down, one-size-fits-all global solutions, and a third part's very important, when any dissent from that opinion, any dissent is being stamped upon with ever-increasing ferocity, he says that is the sign of a scam, that you always have to prick up your ears when those three things come together. And that move, that insistence on a collectivist approach that brooks no dissent, is really at the heart of why I think we really have to think before we sign what I regard, being Agenda 2030, as a suicide note for half the population of the planet.
Yeah. I mean, one point I utterly agree with is that there is not one answer. You know, people are saying we have to do this. That is not the case. It is a combination of things we have to do. And it's about balance. Life is a massive balancing act. And the reality is, you know, if we just stop producing oil tomorrow, the world would stop. So that's not actually possible. What we have to do is try and plan. And actually, we should try and utilize, like renewables being the next industrial revolution, to make cost of living cheaper for us, but actually fit it into being more sustainable as well. On the 4th of Jan 2023, 88% of our power produced in the UK was from renewable source, which is amazing. So it shows it is possible to get to this 100% and actually grow with it. So from my point of view, I think it's about balance. You know, we can't just rush things. And I understand your sentiment saying that, you know, there are people out there that are looking to profiteer from it. I'm very much about saying, look, we need to look at this and work together. And it's important to have debate as well.
Andrew Eborn, what say you? I think it's in the marrow of my bones that I'm suspicious about collectivist global solutions that will entertain no debate and talk about consensus and the science. What's your reaction?
I think you're absolutely right. Whenever you shut down debate, then absolutely our hackles should rise, because the reality, we must question everything. We become so reliant on so-called experts, and time again experts have been proved wrong. What I found fascinating in the recent election was actually Reform's policy was saying, look, we can get rid of all our troubles about the NHS and underfunding here and so on and so forth if we simply abandon the net zero pledge, which was an interesting take on it. And he was accused, Richard Tice at that stage was accused of weaponizing the climate crisis. But we have to be able to question it, and we have to make sure that we listen to all sides in the debate, because if you shut down debate, then basically you're going to shut down getting the truth.
Greg, you talk about renewables, you know, and for most people, myself included, we're talking there about wind turbines and solar panels. Now, seriously, Greg, those are not sources of energy that can be relied upon round the clock, and most specifically, they cannot be relied upon. The sun doesn't shine when we need it, and the wind doesn't blow when we need it. You know, in what sense is anyone even being realistic about talking about alternatives?
Absolutely agree. And this is where actually now there's been some planning law changes for battery storage, which is something that we need to do. We lose approximately 10 to 20% every day of our renewable power. Now, if we spent money on actually battery storage for that renewable power, so we actually had it at the source for the national grid to draw on, that would actually help the national grid massively, and we could actually start building upon that. And now you can actually get planning permission on Greenbelt for critical infrastructure for these battery solutions. And it's something that more and more people are going to start investing in. And I think combined with the new Labour government, I think it could be something that works really well.
Greg Gormley, thank you very much for your brave contribution in the face of my cynicism. But I have to reiterate that as far as I'm concerned, the so-called climate crisis is the biggest hoax yet foisted upon the human species on this planet. But thank you very much for your insights, Greg.
Thank you.
Next on the show, I'll be discussing a truly momentous week in American politics, as President Donald Trump survived an assassination attempt before giving us the name of his running mate for his presidential bid. I'll see you soon. Welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. To put it mildly, it's been an eventful week in US politics with an assassination attempt on President Trump and a new Republican vice presidential candidate being named, and President Biden apparently coming down with COVID. Here to discuss all of that and more, I'm joined now by Jimmy Dore, comedian and political commentator. Hello, Jimmy.
Hello, great to be with you again.
Oh, thanks, Jimmy. Always good to hear your voice. I listened to our mutual friend Tucker Carlson, cogitating in the aftermath of what happened, and he said that it seemed to him that something had changed that day. That the shooting transformed Trump in some sort of way, that he is now visibly a leader and a brave man. What was your gut reaction?
It was uncommonly brave. I couldn't think of a politician doing that. You'd think that once there's an active shooter and you've already been shot in a part of your head, that you would just stay down, and he didn't. And what was even so that was really fascinating. And once you saw him raise his fist and say "fight, fight, fight," you couldn't help but feel the emotion of the moment. And then his crowd, the thing that I think is even more remarkable than that was that normally when there's a shooting, people just scatter and they trip over each other and they trample each other. And they didn't do that. They sat there calmly and they kind of followed Trump's lead. And I think that was an incredible moment of leadership, right? Because maybe if he didn't do that, maybe if he didn't get up and show his resilience and put his fist in the air and say fight, maybe they would have got scared and scrambled. But there was someone behind him, a couple people behind him who got shot, and a fireman actually got shot and died. So and people did not scramble around and trample over each other, which is what always happens in those situations. So yeah, it was remarkable how it's changed him. I don't know. I did hear that leaked phone call where he was on the phone with Bobby Kennedy. And I've never heard a politician sound more magnanimous. And even to Joe Biden, the guy who's been prosecuting him, using lawfare, weaponizing the justice system against his political opponent, Donald Trump, he was even magnanimous to him and said nice things about him on the call. So I'm not close enough to him like Tucker to know that it's changed him, but it certainly was quite. It was a moment of leadership, and it was stunning. Actually, I didn't think Trump had that in him.
Yeah, you mentioned the clip that went out of Bobby Kennedy Jr. Receiving a phone call in the aftermath, and I was struck by the way in which Donald Trump. And it was him talking, not Kennedy. He absolutely does not sound on that call like you might say the caricature Trump that's always pushed by the legacy media. He wasn't. And when he spoke at the convention, he didn't take the opportunity to be divisive or to stoke anything at all. He really does come across in those unguarded moments. And if there was a definition of an unguarded moment, it was that bullet, whizzing past his ear. He comes across as quite different than the way his opponents generally seek to portray him.
Well, yeah, they have to portray him as a madman. They have to portray him as this racist, madman, white supremacist, all these things, because Donald Trump, my theory is this, that Donald Trump is a deal maker. He really is a successful businessman. And they used to all praise him before he ran for president. They used to all want to be they were all golf buddies, right? That he was on every late night talk show in America. They gave him his own television show for over 10 years. They gave him, he's got his own star on the Walk of Fame on Hollywood Boulevard. I mean, the establishment loved that guy. So the fact that he didn't come up through the traditional political machine, so they didn't have control of him. And it's not that he was that wildly different or he was going to govern that wildly different, but they didn't have complete control of him. So they had to try to demonize him. And then when the demonization didn't work, they tried to Russiagate him and they tried to say he was a traitor to our country. And there's lots of theories about this, that he puts an ugly, because he speaks in such a brash way, that he puts an ugly face on imperialism, and it's harder to invade smaller countries and steal their natural resources with a guy like Donald Trump than it is with a guy like Barack Obama or Joe Biden. And so he puts a bad face on imperialism, especially now that they've been painting him as a madman and a white supremacist for all these years. They can't have that. And he's also bad for their wars. I think the real big deal is that Donald Trump, because he comes from business, he's always looking for a deal. And he prides himself on, his book was called The Art of the Deal. So he's going to find a deal. He even said that in his speech last night. He said, I will end that Ukraine war. It would have never happened if I was president. And I can end a war with one phone call. And so he prides himself on that. Whereas it seems like everybody else in the political spectrum in America prides themselves on being a warmonger.
That's it then for our TV hour. Thanks to all my guests. Thanks to Andrew Aborn for bearing with me and handling this slightly different version of the show. Please, to all of you, stay tuned for the brilliant Free Speech Nation. But we have more content coming up online. As I say, Jimmy Dore is staying with me, moving on afterwards to discussing Russia with George Samueli and the rise of the right with Ralph Schulhammer, another familiar friend of the show. Don't miss any of it, and I'll see you next week. Good evening and welcome along to the second hour of the Neil Oliver Show online. This is where I get the chance to be a bit more relaxed, to let conversations breathe a little, to let my guests cogitate and develop thoughts. Welcome back, and let's pick up with the conversation that began in the first hour, talking to comedian and political commentator Jimmy Dore. Welcome back, Jimmy.
Great to see you, Neil.
Jimmy, like you, I was paying some attention to the way in which, let's say those parts of the legacy media in the States that do not approve of President Trump and much prefer President Biden, the way in which they reacted. Good Morning Joe on MSNBC, and for example, the way in which that show simply didn't broadcast. In the immediate aftermath. I watched some of your content with that in mind. I wonder if you could develop some of your thoughts there.
Well, it was funny because they're supposed to be like their flagship program that everybody watches in the morning, and they didn't let them on the air because Joe Scarborough and the people he surrounds himself with are such foaming at the mouth maniacs that they were afraid they were going to say something inappropriate about Donald Trump's assassination attempt. And it turns out they have been saying that. So they replaced him with someone named Joy-Ann Reid, who's possibly the only person at that station crazier than him. And she's now floating a conspiracy theory that Donald Trump staged that whole event and that it's fishy and all things like that. Hey, there's a lot of questions that need to be asked that aren't being answered. And the official story certainly doesn't make sense. But the idea that Donald Trump, who got 4 deferments from the Vietnam War, when he's leading an election and it looks like he's going to win a landslide, would all of a sudden go, hey, you know what? I got an idea. Let's have somebody shoot me in the head just for kicks and, just to see if it'll get my numbers up even more so I can win by an even bigger margin. And right at the last second, I'll turn my head and just have him blow a hole through my ear and then kill a guy behind me. So that's the crazy conspiracy theories they were afraid that Morning Joe was going to say, and they replaced him with someone like Joy-Ann Reid. And of course, she's just as crazy. They're all crazy over there. I mean, they did Russiagate at the top of their lungs they're still doing it. So it hasn't stopped for 8 years now. And which is the goofiest, most easily debunked conspiracy theory that I've ever seen, that the president of the United States was a traitor and working for another country. In fact, they had an investigation into it for years, and the conclusion was absolutely no evidence that would substantiate that allegation. That didn't bother them. They just keep doing it. They just keep going over and over. They say that since he picked his vice president, J.D. Vance, that at MSNBC, they say the person who's most happy about that is Vladimir Putin. I mean, they just won't stop. So yeah, that was really funny. And Joe Scarborough, his feathers got ruffled because they took him off the air because they know what a nut he is. And when they let him back on the air, he said if they ever do that again, that he's going to quit. He didn't use those words. The words he said was, "I won't be sitting in this chair." So yeah, that was really funny to see that even NBC knows how unhinged the hosts of their flagship show is.
There was something very glaring and revealing, I thought. Given that for months the language of, targeting Trump and suggesting that it would be a good idea, to be rid was there all the time, and then when it actually almost happened, they just didn't know how to respond. Because if they've been calling him a Hitler or a Stalin or a would-be dictator for months at least. And you would have thought, if that was true, then you would want rid of him. But then when a bullet actually flew and it grazed Trump, and as you say, another bullet killed a husband and father, when that which they seemed to be calling for was all but conjured into being, they suddenly didn't know what to do.
Well, they've been not only calling Donald Trump Hitler and Stalin and a threat to our democracy. The day before the assassination attempt, Joe Biden was on stage in front of a crowd saying, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, Donald Trump and MAGA, meaning his political movement, are a threat to our democracy. And so he's not only smearing and slandering Donald Trump, his political opponent, but the citizens of the United States, half the country, who are prepared to vote for him, right? And so, yeah, you're right. When that happened, they didn't know how to handle it. In fact, Joe Biden gave a speech where he eulogized the husband and father who was shot. Just the day before, you were saying those people were a threat to our democracy. Just the day before, you were saying those people don't respect the Constitution, that those people aren't Americans. And then as soon as they got shot, you're right, he had to completely change his tune. It's like, oh, well, this guy is a great American, and we have our our hearts and soul go out to him. Our thoughts and prayers are with him. And they didn't know how to critique Donald Trump because the only way they know how to critique him is in the most hyperbolic ways, by saying that he's going to be a dictator on day one, which is a complete mischaracterization of what he said. He said he said, I'm going to be a dictator on just for the first day because he's going to pass executive orders about the border. And which is completely within his constitutional rights to do. In fact, people are voting for him, so he does do that. And so they're also, when he talked about if he wasn't president, that there would be a bloodbath in the auto industry, which is a very common term in politics. They talk about bloodbaths when it comes to elections or bloodbaths when it comes to economics or anything. And so they misquote him and said that he's pretending that there's going to be an actual physical, violent bloodbath if he's not elected. Of course, so they don't know any other way to talk about him. So it was funny to watch them try to now talk about Donald Trump without calling him Hitler, calling him a threat to our democracy, calling him an enemy of our country and an enemy of our Constitution, and he's going to be a dictator. It was comical. It's still comical to watch them do that. But so now they're saying that his vice presidential pick is a favorite of Vladimir Putin. They went back to that on MSNBC. And Rachel Maddow says that he's obviously a racist because he likes, what is that, J.K. Rowling? Now I can't remember, the Lord of the Rings. So they're really unhinged over there. Like when I was getting my chops in politics in the late 80s, early 90s, it was always the right wing in the United States, the Republican Party, that were the people that were unhinged, that wanted to pass laws that made it mandatory that you had to pray to a god in school. And they were always on the fringes, but it's completely flipped. And now, in fact, you see at the Republican convention, union leaders, workers are now praising J.D. Vance, and they're invited to the Republican convention. That's a complete flip-flop. So the Democratic Party, the party of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, has gone from being the party of working class people to being the party of white-collar suburban women. That's basically who votes for the Democrats now. And they don't want to talk about the fact that they've lost workers and the blue collar people, that those people aren't going to vote for them and don't vote for them anymore. Donald Trump had, I don't mean to change the subject, but he had a brilliant piece of political strategy. He told a story at his speech last night about how he was having dinner at one of his hotels in Las Vegas. And the waitress, he asked her, how is it going? And she said, well, they're taking my taxes out of my tips. So in the United States, a big part of people who do service industry jobs like Uber drivers and cab drivers and waitresses and maids and bartenders, a big part of their salary is that they get tipped, right? So that's not the same as it is in Europe. And but that's commonly they get 20% tips, right, on anything they do. And in the 80s, that they decided to tax those tips before they were untaxed. And so now they tax those tips. And she said, well, I wish they wouldn't tax my tips. And Donald Trump didn't even realize that that was a thing because he's been a billionaire his whole life. And so his big proposal is to take that tax away. Do you know how many votes that's the thing that's going to take people who don't vote and turn them into voters, or people who are on the fence about voting, and it's going to make sure they show up to vote. That's him doing something directly for the blue collar worker of America that nobody's done in decades and in a generation for them. So that was a brilliant so in that moment, he's getting to the left of the Democratic Party. This guy who they paint as an extreme right winger, as a Hitler, as a Stalin, he is at the snap of a finger, he's gotten economically to the left of those entire Democratic Party. And it's not that hard to do because the Democrats are completely in the pocket of Wall Street, the military industrial complex, big pharma, and health insurance companies. And so Donald Trump, it takes just one move like that, and he can be a hero of the workers, which that is a move that actually will make him a hero of workers.
Jimmy Dore, bear with me. I'm just going to bring in Andrew Eborn in the studio in London. Andrew, like me, we grew up, did we not, in this country, on this side of the Atlantic, watching the movies, watching television series, and really sort of internalizing the idea that the Democratic Party in the States were the goodies, the white hat wearing cowboys riding to the rescue. What are we to make of what the Democrat Party does next? What ought they to do? What can they do?
Well, it is extraordinary, isn't it? And talking about flip-flop, the biggest flip-flop of all was J.D. Vance, which sounds like a sort of a discount sportswear store, doesn't it? What he basically said, talking about the rhetoric and how that changed, he called Trump a potential American Hitler and cultural heroine and an idiot and so on and so forth. And he said that was back in 2016. And what he did, there's nothing more persuasive than a convert, the road to Damascus moment, if you like. Because what he said in interviews when lots of journalists rightly brought it up. He said, well, that's what I thought then, but I now realise that Trump was a brilliant president, and I've changed my mind on him. And I've also realised the media lies about Trump. So working on that sort of basis, and just as your other guest was talking about, Trump is brilliant at working on that sort of basis, working out how you can do the art of the deal, bringing in other people on that sort of thing. So he's almost guaranteed to win now. And I think he was. He's a changed man from as a result of the horrendous events that we saw with that shooting. But it's right, whenever there's a vacuum, that's when the conspiracy theories come in, and that's why we need to sort of work out. There are so many questions to be asked about those particular shootings, why the Secret Service didn't scan the appropriate buildings and so on and so forth. Why was that particular person allowed so close when others in the crowd could spot him and alerted that sort of side? All of those questions need to be answered. But I think in terms of Trump, from what I've seen, he certainly seems a different man in terms of that. Certainly the rhetoric has changed and the ballistic sort of language has been turned down. And I think that's absolutely right and proper.
Jimmy Dore, how do you assess the choice of JD? What do you make of that? I myself, I was most aware of him because of that memoir, the Hillbilly Eulogy, or I can't remember the name of the
Elegy.
book, but Elegy. It was a very effective movie.
Hillbilly Elegy, that's it.
Yeah. Jimmy, what was your initial reaction and response when you heard that JD Vance was to be the running mate?
Well, I was, I was hoping he was going to pick RFK Jr., but I think RFK had already turned him down for that, right? So that was my first. But I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. But the fact that JD Vance gets accolades from the head of the Teamsters Union, right, for being on their side on all the big issues at the time, getting health care for railroad workers and to stop outsourcing jobs out of the country. And and plus he's very strong on the Ukraine issue, right? So that's way better than any Democrat right now. That's kind of amazing. And so it's basically saying that JD Vance is now the leading candidate to be president in 2028, right? And because there's no doubt that if he doesn't get assassinated, Donald Trump, that he's going to be president and JD Vance will be the vice president. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. He's a little bit of a saber rattler when it comes to China. And of course, he's in the pocket of the AIPAC lobby, which is Israel, right? Which is there isn't a viable candidate in the United States that doesn't seem to work for AIPAC in Israel. So go ahead.
Do you think that plays in a bit to what you were saying about Trump as a deal maker, and certainly a self-described deal maker? Do you think that element of necessary compromise appeals to him, possibly? The idea that this is a person who has points that play to my point of view and others that fly in the face of my point of view. Do you think it appeals to his need to strike a deal?
So, it's funny. I just found a piece of video the other day of Donald Trump talking about what he often speaks in hyperbolic language, right? And that's him. He's asking for he's always thinking about how to make a deal. So he asks for the moon, and then he doesn't start from his compromise position. He starts from a position where he's willing to work down from. And so he speaks over the top hyperbole when it comes to the Israel-Gaza situation. And he, again, gives all the lip service possible he can to the Israeli position. But here's the thing. I saw a video where he talked about, he goes, yeah, I think I can make a deal. So that's, again, what he wants to do. He wants to find a deal for the Palestinians and the Israelis that everybody could be happy with. But what he said in this video was that it turns out one side doesn't want to make a deal. And they asked him, which side is that? He said, well, I don't want to say because I don't want to tip my hand. But then I found another video where he said he had a meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu and he said, Bibi, let's make a deal. And it didn't. What kind of deal do you want? And Bibi didn't want a deal. And he said, you don't even want one. And so I think that that bodes well. That to me, he would be a better person to negotiate the Israel-Palestine problem than Joe Biden or anybody else in politics right now in the United States on a national level. So you're exactly right. I think that his flex, which is why he never got into a war. He was the president for 4 years. He's the only president in my lifetime didn't start a war. Barack Obama was not a departure from George Bush. He took us from 2 wars to 7 wars, right? And you see what Joe Biden did. Everybody gave him accolades for getting us out of Afghanistan. But the reason why he was allowed to get us out of Afghanistan by the military-industrial complex was because he had another war in the chamber, and it was the Ukraine war that they've been ramping up for since at least 2014 when the United States overthrew the democratically elected government of Ukraine. So you're right. I think it's the lesser of two evil in this situation is not Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, which, by the way, Joe Biden is going to drop out now because Barack Obama has publicly come out against him.
Jimmy Dore, as always, it's a real pleasure to hear you, ruminate and your quick fire thoughts about all of this. So I'll look forward to talking to you again in the near future. But for tonight, thank you so much, Jimmy Dore.
My pleasure. Good to see you. Thanks for everything.
Thank you. Another break's upon us, after which Ukraine. Is Ukraine the dividing line? What are we to make of the incoming government committing us to, forever war in Ukraine for as long as it takes? We'll be picking that up after the break. You're watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. welcome back to the Neil Oliver Show. Now, freshly minted UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has pledged, quote, unshakable support as Volodymyr Zelensky visited Downing Street. Meanwhile, Donald Trump's freshly announced vice presidential candidate JD Vance doubled down on reducing support for Ukraine, and Germany planned to halve their military aid towards that country. To discuss all of that and more, to consider what all of that might mean, I am joined now by George Samweli from the Global Policy Institute. George, it's good to see you again.
It's good to be with you, Neil.
George, I'm sure you saw the footage of Volodymyr Zelensky at the heart of British government, sitting with the cabinet alongside Keir Starmer. How did you sort of instinctively respond to that, given a Ukrainian president at the heart of British government at a time when others around the world are pulling back?
Well, I felt very much, I think, as you do, which is here we have in the UK serious rioting, serious domestic social problems, and there's this new prime minister who he's only been there in office, I think, 2 weeks, and he has made clear that his one overriding preoccupation is Ukraine. I find this very strange. I mean, you've won an election, and one would think that your overriding priority would be to do something for the British people, the people who supposedly put you into office. But no, he is entirely obsessed with helping Ukraine. Now, as for the rest of your question, it's a very interesting issue, because if there is to be a change in power in Washington in November, and that's a distinct possibility, then there could very well be a change in policy towards Ukraine. If that happens, the British and, of course, the Europeans will be stuck with this policy that they have committed themselves to for no reason other than to keep in with the Americans. This was an American-driven policy. It just so happens that it was driven by a Democratic administration that could well be out of power very shortly. And now, having wedded themselves to this policy of a Democratic administration, the British and the EU are going to be stuck looking very, very foolish, because the one thing we know about the Americans is when they decide upon something, they aren't going to pay any attention to what their ostensible allies think. We saw that in the case of Afghanistan when Biden decided to pull out, and it didn't matter what the British thought or what the Europeans thought. Biden just went ahead and did it. And I think that if there's going to be a change in policy in Washington, they will just do it, and they're not going to pay any attention at all to what the British or the Europeans think.
Yeah, it's very interesting when you put it in those terms. You know, that Keir Starmer would appear to be short-sighted about the possibility of in the reasonably, or actually the very short term, Britain being embarrassed by being isolated with a commitment. Sometimes I've seen it described as 100 years worth of commitment to Ukraine. If a Trump-led administration in Washington decides to take another tack entirely, it's very hard to, what it must be like for yourself, because here in Britain, it's very hard to try and make sense of a new leader who, with his remarks about preferring Davos to the goings-on in Westminster, and now placing a foreign government's interests ahead of anything in Britain. It's very hard for us to make sense of that in any other terms, but as though we're being told by our new leader that British interests are secondary to others around the world.
Well, yes, so that is exactly the position he is taking, but he's not alone in that. Many European leaders have also taken that line. The German foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, famously said maybe about 18 months ago that I don't really care what German voters think. I'm only interested in Ukraine. And she just said, in a very brutal way, what many political leaders in Europe think. Emmanuel Macron also declares that his overriding interest is Ukraine, even though we can see what the French voters think. We know where the French voters, they support the farmers who are being absolutely destroyed by cheap Ukrainian grain. They're being destroyed by the European Green New Deal. They're being destroyed by ridiculous environmental restrictions that force them to leave about 20% of their land fallow. This is what they care about. And yet Macron, Chancellor Scholz, Annalena Baerbock, Keir Starmer, but even before Keir Starmer, we had Rishi Sunak, Boris Johnson, all of them are preoccupied with Ukraine. And then you have to ask, well, why? Why are you so obsessed with Ukraine? What's Ukraine to you? Ukraine's not a member of the EU. Ukraine's not a member of NATO. You've made no commitments at all to Ukraine. Why are you so preoccupied with it? Well, because, of course, they have a very different agenda. Their agenda, this whatever one calls it, a kind of globalist World Economic Forum agenda, and that involves their keeping in with the US on Ukraine. Somehow that's part of their kind of internationalism, transatlanticism, NATO expansion, all those wonderful things they're supposed to support. But of course, there's a real problem with that, because what if the United States decide, well, this may not be such a great investment for us, and Trump had said this back in 2015, 2016, that it doesn't make any sense for the United States to have bad relations with Russia, because for us, the Americans, China is a greater threat. Now, whether you agree with that position or you don't agree with that position, that Trump clearly articulated that in 2015, 2016, and he's suggesting that that's his view today as well. It's certainly the view of J.D. Vance, who's saying, hey, if China is the biggest threat we face, then shouldn't it make sense for us to improve our relations with Russia? Why do we antagonize Russia? Why do we expand NATO? Why does that help us in any way? It's just giving us a lot more headaches and a lot of commitments that we don't really have the means to fulfill. And so therefore, it's going to be, could well be, a major reversal of policy. And then what's going to happen to the Europeans? Suddenly, they have to think about improving relations with Russia. They've had clear warnings of this. Viktor Orban, who submitted this report the other day to President of the European Council, Charles Michel, he said, there's going to be a change in Washington. It makes sense now, today, for the Europeans to begin opening diplomatic lines of communications to Moscow in anticipation of a possible change in Washington.
Bear with me, George Samuel, while I involve also Andrew Eborn in the studio in London. Andrew, what was your automatic response to the pictures of Volodymyr Zelensky and therefore Ukraine being put metaphorically and literally at the heart of the freshly minted British government?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And George, it's always a pleasure to see George and share a studio with him. The reality is that we have our own issues. We have our own issues, and they should be front and centre. And George mentioned about Viktor Orban. I mean, he was the great peacemaker, if you like. He's met with Russia, he's met with China, he's trying to do this. And rather than people getting behind him, there was a letter written on the 15th of July, signed by a number of European members of Parliament, who basically called for Hungary to lose its voting rights under Article 7, because they said that his mission, peace mission, was basically not authorised. It wasn't consistent with EU policy, which was basically to support Ukraine. So I think I always make the point, look, we're not trying to take either side in this. What we are is pro-peace. And I think the more that discussions along those sort of lines are shut down, the more dangerous it gets. But the rhetoric in this is very dangerous, very expensive, both in terms of money and also lives.
George Samueli, how much attention should we pay, when you talk about perhaps a change of administration in Washington and what that might mean for American interests, but we also look on at Ukraine and contemplate the involvement there of transnational entities like BlackRock, enormous other transnational corporations like ExxonMobil and Chevron and Halliburton, poised to take advantage of the natural resources there. Do you think that has any bearing? Is British policy, Keir Starmer Labour policy, being shaped by corporations, that kind of stakeholder capitalism, rather than the national interests of America or anyone else?
No, I think that in the case of Keir Starmer, I think that's a fairly consistent theme of successive administrations in the United Kingdom. It is that we need to, at all times, to keep in with the Americans. Whoever's the American president, we have to follow the Americans, because somehow the only way Britain gets to punch above its weight in world affairs is through its so-called special relationship with the United States. Of course, it's entirely one-sided, the special relationship. The Americans certainly don't regard the British as in any way a special relationship. The British regard the Americans as a special relation. But nonetheless, all prime ministers, ever since the hapless Anthony Eden, have believed that they have, at all times, they must keep in with the Americans. And I think that Keir Starmer is part of that. But to your point about the corporations, absolutely, that the United States has been driven by buying up the entirety of Ukraine. And that started immediately after the Maidan overthrow of the government of Viktor Yanukovych. All the corporations moved in, and all the various carpetbaggers, such as Hunter Biden, Hunter Biden's friends, they all moved in within months of the overthrow of the legal government of Ukraine to make a lot of money. And that's why the Biden and the Biden people, all these various Democrats, are so wedded to this policy in Ukraine, because they and all their friends and associates are making a lot of money. And, they've bought up all the agricultural land, that's now owned by international corporations. They've bought up all the natural resources, again, owned by corporations. And of course, as you said, there are all these hedge funds planning on making big investments guaranteed by the U.S. government. They're not just going to throw their own money around. Guaranteed by the U.S. government, they're going to make a lot of money. So there's a huge amount of money. The least that anyone is worried about is the people of Ukraine. So there's a lot of money to be made here, and this is the way to sort of keep together this bogus transatlantic alliance.
George Samuel, I think it's for me, what breaks me, is the way in which it is the people of Ukraine that are just being overlooked and or trampled underfoot in the midst of all of this, and that this shameless laundering of money, this pursuit of profit via a war that's perpetuated for no other reason but to make profit is. I think is becoming increasingly hard to look at without, feeling physically ill. But George Samueli, thank you once again. I'll be calling upon you for further insight in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you for joining me tonight. Another break is upon us, but after that, I'll be speaking to Ralph Schulhammer, because in the tradition of the Neil Oliver Show, it is now Ralph Schulhammer time. Okay, it's that point in the week that I've come to know as Ralph Schulhammer time. It's always a valuable time spent for me with Ralph, thinking about and sharing the thoughts that he's been developing through the course of the week just past. Ralph Schulhammer, are you there?
I am there. So good to talk to you, Neil.
So good to hear your voice, Ralph. I know, because you have intimated as much, that this week you've been contemplating the emergence or the re-emergence of nationalism and patriotism, which are troubling words for some people for many reasons. But I think you've been contemplating them as a new unifying force in Europe and in the US. Could you develop that thesis for us?
Yeah, I think so. And I think we can actually tie together two events that just happened recently in the United Kingdom. And I think that maybe makes it also clearer for your viewers and listeners. So on the one hand, you had the events that currently unfolded in Leeds, right? Where you had what I would, as a form of, I would say, ethnical conflict. And then you had the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, recently sent out a tweet where he said that at the heart of his government is Ukraine. And I think this is something, you cannot be a state, you cannot be a nation if parts of your population start to subscribe and identify more with their, let's say, non-British ethnical group. And you have a government that apparently says that the foreign government is at the heart of their concern, of their governing. Right? I mean, whatever one thinks about these conflicts and these issues, you cannot be a nation state if nobody in charge believes in the nation anymore. And I think that really is a core issue. And the argument that has been made since the 1950s, I would argue, that the biggest threat to peace and stability is nationalism, is patriotism, is a kind of a strong sense of loyalty to your country. I don't think that this holds true. I don't think it ever held true, but I definitely don't think it holds true anymore in nowadays society. And I think we see this in the United States. We saw this during the Republican convention. I mean, take somebody like Donald Trump, who himself called himself just a couple of years ago a nationalist. Now look at their convention. Like in so many areas, he can take a more moderate position, whether it's abortion, whether it's same-sex marriage, whether it's the economy, where I think the party has made a significant shift to the left. But he can do this because people intuitively trust him, at least on the right side of the aisle, because they understand that he's a patriot. They understand that they are playing on the same team. Now, I know this seems maybe old-fashioned, but I think these things still matter. The more people have the sense that those who govern them are not really interested in their well-being anymore, the harder it will be to remain a nation, and the harder it will be both for those who are governed and for those who want to govern.
There's a strange dissonance, it seems to me, Ralph, where on the one hand, as you say, for the longest time, we've been being discouraged across Europe, in the West, to be nationalist and patriotic. You know, we've been encouraged to think about no borders, no boundaries, and setting aside those kind of old and troublesome ideas of love of country, while at the same time we've got leaders championing the right to defend the nationhood of Ukraine. And we've also got others, or some of the same people, absolutely championing the right of Israel to protect its borders and to protect its existence. You know, it's hard to see how the general population are supposed to bring those two conflicting ideas together.
Yeah, I think, because I believe it's a form of projection. This is one of the biggest phenomenons of what, quote unquote, we can call postmodernity, right? So we created a gaping hole in, let's say, the soul of the West that usually was filled with loyalty to religion, to the nation, to your home. But nothing really could fill that hole. So we came up with all kinds of ersatz beliefs, of ersatz places to defend. As you say, some people wave the flag of Israel, some people wave the flag of Palestine, some people wave the flag of Ukraine, right? Some people wave the Pride Progress flag. Some people completely indulge in environmentalism, and the green fanatism. But I think these are all ersatz religions. These are ersatz nationalisms in many ways. And I think the examples that you mentioned, it's glaringly obvious, precisely as you said. If I wave a British flag, an Austrian flag, a German flag, I'm immediately suspicious that I have maybe fascist leanings or maybe something even worse. But at the same time, I'm expected to, quote Keir Starmer, to put another nation's interest at the heart of my government, at the heart of my political interest. There is this massive disconnect. And I think this is precisely the problem. We talk about this very often, of the contemporary elites. They want to love something. They want to be loyal to something. But since they have been marinated and socialized in this idea that you cannot love your own country, you cannot love your own community, they now basically project this desire to love something, if you want to use that strong expression, onto something else. And I believe this is very much what we see. Now, I'm slightly exaggerating, but I think this is really a phenomenon we see. It's not the same in all cases, but I think this is something we really, really are experiencing at the moment.
Ralph, bear with me. Andrew Ebon in the studio in London. It's a very interesting thought, isn't it? I think it was G.K. Chesterton who said that if you take away religion from people, they don't believe in nothing, rather they believe in anything.
Right.
And I think to develop that idea of Ralph's, that if you take away love of your own country from people, then that need either willingly or unwillingly is projected somewhere else. But are our leaders so-called reaping the poisoned harvest of decades of undermining meaning in people's lives and love of country, love of home?
No, I think you're absolutely right. People need purpose in their life. And by their very nature, by our very nature, we are tribal. This is why you follow football teams and various other things with such passion. And the trouble is this, Neil and Ralph, and I love your Ralph hammer time. I think that's hilarious. So good one on that. But the reality is this, is that when times are tough, we basically pull up the hatches, don't we? We say, look, we blame it on all these jolly foreigners and all these other people from different tribes. And as a result, we try to look to our own, as it were. And there is that sort of, why you might see the rise of the right on that sort of basis. The biggest concern that I have is that we live in a very diseased information age where we're surrounding ourselves with our own prejudices. We're listening just to people who have the same ideas of us, and so on and so forth. And that's not good for the world as a whole, is it?
Ralph, you mentioned at the top there what is happening, has been happening in Leeds. I'm always very sensitive to the thought that, as well as that trouble being what it is, it feels increasingly, this being one event amongst many, that all of this is being stoked. It feels as if the same one, ill-willing, malevolent hand is pulling all of the same strings, and that it's so convenient that we'd be invited to, concentrate on Leeds, and concentrate on a racial issue or a religious issue, or make it look that way, while overlooking the fact that all of us ordinary people feel increasingly that we're just being herded from one chaotic situation to the next, to prevent us having the time and the organisation to pull together.
No, I completely agree. I think also what your guest in the studio says is absolutely right. So this is something that's very important for me to say, because I think both of you made an excellent and important point. When we take this issue of patriotism and nationalism, I think it's very important to say that this is, for me at least, and I think for most people who understand it this way, particularly also in the UK, it's a cultural term. Right, so I have many, and I'm sure you do as well. I have many people of different religion and ethnic backgrounds who are fervent Austrian patriots and Austrian nationalists. And then I have Austrian friends and acquaintances who are just as white as I am, who have completely fallen victim to this wonderful term that the British philosopher Roger Scruton termed oikophobia, like fear of your own, a rejection of your own. So this is not something that has anything to do with race, heritage, or you name it, right? You can choose an identity. You can come to a country. It's what Konstantin Kissin wrote in his book, right? A Love Letter to the West, or an immigrant's love letter to the West. And the other point, I think you're also absolutely correct. Something is breaking at the moment. Now, I cannot tell you, and we will have to investigate this in our further conversations, to what extent this is on purpose and to what extent it is those who are responsible are also losing control. I think there is something going on here. But I cannot really put my finger on it. I think it's a mixture, right? It's a mixture of what we also discussed in great detail of deliberate malfeasance, of incompetence, and of people entirely overestimating their capacities and capabilities.
I'm increasingly of a mind to watch what I'm being encouraged to look at and wonder why I'm being asked to look at that, because it makes me feel as if I'm probably in the manner of a magician, don't look at this hand while this other hand does something else. And also, yes, as we've discussed recently, Ralph, the elections that have gone across Europe and in the UK, where we've seen the rise of the so-called right, and the rise of and the success and the popularity of those who champion family and community and country and nation and borders, the fact that those centralising, the bureaucrats and the rest, the WEF and the WHO, tried to stamp down on that kind of natural feeling makes me think if they don't like it, it must be because it is that which they perceive as the greatest threat to them.
Yes, and by the way, as you said, they do it in the open. Again, precisely the conversation we are having right now. I have it time and time and again, and people say, "Oh, Ralph, you are a conspiracy theorist." And say there is no conspiracy. You heard it just recently. So the European Union is now picking a fight with Elon Musk because they are terrified of Twitter and X, because you can disseminate information that they don't like. Right? They just recently closed down a magazine in Germany, not my kind of magazine, but that's beyond the point. And they basically repurposed a law against illegal organizations and said, well, having a magazine is the same as being an organization, therefore we can ban you without any court action, without anything. And of course, it's a massive infringement on free speech, and everybody hopes now that the Constitutional Court will undo this, but even if it has to go to the Constitutional Court, is already a problem. The other thing I think we have to talk about, and Michiel mentioned it previously, what just happened in the United States. I mean, I'm just in awe to believe, can the Secret Service really be that incompetent, or is there something else going on? I mean, the more information that comes out here, I'm sorry. I mean, either they are complete dullards, or it is something else. And to be honest, I don't know which answer to those two questions would make me more comfortable, because I think both answers would be frustrating.
I was talking with a previous guest, Ralph. Andrew and I discussed it. I'm so discombobulated by the metamorphosis of the United States of America. You know, as one of my kind of vintage who grew up trusting the Democrat Party rather than the Republican Party, and the way they were invariably portrayed as the good guys and the people with the better ideas in any television series or any movie. And now I look on at America, and I honestly just don't know what I'm looking at. You know, is it the end of an empire?
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, one thing I always tend to say, but maybe I said it one time too often, is never underestimate the United States. I mean, they had weird and crazy periods in their history before Andrew Jackson, right? Or you had Woodrow Wilson, who after a stroke, where basically his wife was running the government. So these things have happened before, and very often the United States showed a very strong capacity to renew and reinvent themselves. And in many ways, more than ever before, I mean, this is so fascinating. I believe that at the moment, Donald Trump turns out to be a unifying figure, whatever you think about him. But if you look at his politics, if you look at the way in which he's talking, even before the assassination attempt and even now, this is not a man of anger. Right? This is not a man who wants to divide the country. This is a man who, I believe, in many ways, if we want to use this term, because we have gotten so used to no longer using it, a heroic individual in many ways, at least in the reaction to the assassination attempt. But he has his foibles, he has his moral failings. So no, I'm not saying he's a demigod or anything. But I believe that kind of this outsider nature that he has, that maybe this is what's very often needed. I think that the political managerial class that we have in so many parts of the West are really part of the problem, because ultimately they despise the population, because they see themselves as the technocrats who know all the best solutions, who know what's supposed to do, and the electorate, the people, we are more or less in the way of doing what they believe is right, which you and I agree very often is not right, because we saw this unfold over the last couple of decades. But I think this is really a difference, and this is why I'm still hopeful for the United States. For all the flaws they have, right? For all the misbehaves, for all the crimes they have committed, I think on the long run, a renewed United States is to the benefit of all of us.
Absolutely, Ralph Schulhammer. I've always loved the thought of America, and I've always thought that the American concept of a nation was unrealized or not, is such a wonderful potential idea, to even attempt to live up to. But potent stuff, fascinating stuff. Ralph Schulhammer, we will continue this conversation very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. All the best to London.
Thank you. You've been watching the Neil Oliver Show on GB News. Thank you to all of my guests, especially to the ever-tolerant and ever-patient Andrew Eborn, Ralph Schulhammer, everyone else. We will be back, God willing, next week.